Fantasy fight. Marvelous Marvin Hagler versus James Toney. Let's talk about it. First of all, of the two boxers, James Toney is the better defensive fighter. Point blank, period. Marvin Hagler, and this is proven because if you look at James Toney's career, you will notice a very important fact. He has never been stopped. Marvin Hagler has also never been stopped. But Marvin Hagler would have to knock out James Toney to beat him. He's not going to outpoint James Toney. And he definitely is not going to find it easy to land on James Toney, even though Marvin Hagler was a switch hitter. James Toney could roll right hand, left hand. He could do it all. Now, some people will say, but Reggie Johnson gave James Toney all the problems in the world. Montel Griffith gave James Toney all the problems in the world. What's the Nigerian heavyweight guy gave James Toney problems in the world. Roy Jones Jr. gave James Toney problems in the world. Yes, absolutely. All those guys you just mentioned did give James Toney problems. But what was the number one factor with all those guys? All of those guys also were able to roll, slip. They were also slick fighters. I've never thought of Marvin Hagler as a slick fighter. I've never thought of Marvin Hagler as a guy who rolled punches. I know he dipped punches. I know he bobbed and weaved a bit, right? But I never saw him as a guy who was particularly slick. I always looked at him as a hard worker and a guy who's fundamentally sound. Used his jab. If you were too aggressive, he'd use his jab as he did against Roland. Domingo Roland, for those who don't know, Juan Domingo Roland was an Argentinian fighter. Good fighter, was really tagging up. Hagler actually dropped him in the fight. Most of the fighters that fought Marvin Hagler weren't particularly slick fighters, and the particularly slick ones like Willie Monroe Sr. and Sugar Ray Seals and the other guy I'm thinking about who I can't remember, they actually got wins over Marvin Hagler. So slick fighters with good defense, good boxing, good legs, they generally beat Marvin Hagler, including Sugar Ray Leonard, right? So Marvin Hagler wasn't particularly the slickest guy in the world. He could switch hit, which was really good. His brother also could do the same. But at the end of the day, against a guy like James Toney, a defensive maestro, he wasn't particularly slick. His jab would have had some effect on James Toney, at least to begin with, before James Toney made his adjustments. But James Toney, man, sit right in the pocket, right in front of your face. Remind me a little bit of Jack Johnson. I think he has been actually referred to as Jack Johnson, the modern Jack Johnson. The modern old school fighter. He sit right in the pocket in front of you, and you're not touching him. You're just not touching him. Only guy I knew who could do that again was a very skilled defensive fighter in Mike McCallum. And Mike McCallum didn't beat Mike McCallum out of there. Montel Griffith, very skilled, slick, Detroit bound, again, having some of the Michigan style boxer. He reminded me a bit of Ken Norton. Ken Norton reminds me a bit of Ken Norton in terms of his style and how he used to do it. And of course, he was a little guy, about 5'6". He was a small guy with long arms. And he really, his difficult. Montel Griffin also was. No, he wasn't. Okay, so, when you talk about the guys that gave James Toney problems, was it Reggie Green or was it Reggie Johnson? I can't remember which one. But he gave problems, southpaw, of course. But again, he is coming from a slick style. He would use his footwork to get around. And these guys are just an upgrade of Marvin Hagler. So, and just, the inside pivots of James Toney was just beautiful to watch, man. It was a work of art. So I've never seen Marvin Hagler be a guy who would give James Toney problems. He might be easy work for James Toney. James Toney might even get Marvin Hagler out of there because he really hit. And as we all know, James Toney moved all the way up to heavyweight. I was fighting guys at heavyweight. And if we do not forget, he actually knocked out and stopped cold the great Evander Holyfield. That should tell you. That should tell you. James Toney at 160 accomplishing the years. It's like Tank versus Leo Santa Cruz. Leo Santa Cruz was a well-conditioned athlete. Tank got him out of there. He just got that power. You know what I mean? And Marvin Hagler wasn't particularly great defensively. So I could see James Toney catching him with something as he's coming in. And Marvin Hagler just got his senses severed from his body. And his mind severed from his senses. And he's knocked out cold, like cold. And he keeps his head tucked and everything. And James Toney had that same, shift to the left uppercut that he come up the center with. I could see Marvin Hagler, even though his head's tucked, he gets his head goes back and he's just knocked clean coal out. Clean coal out, clean as clock by James Toney. I could see that happening. Like I said before, Marvin Hagler was a hard worker, blue collar fighter. Switch hit, but nothing else really special. Everything else fundamentally sound. It was tough. But I don't see him, I mean, I see Mike McCallum giving him a good run for his money, but I don't see him beating Roy Jones Jr. Special effects, skilled, like a guy. He not beating Roy. He's not beating Roy. He ain't beating Roy. He ain't beating Roy. He's definitely not beating James Toney. Right? Mike McCallum give him a good run for his money, probably even beat him. Because again, guys with defense, it's hard to touch him. And he wasn't going to touch Mike McCallum like that. And Marvin Hagler has always had the utmost respect for Mike McCallum. Because Mike McCallum's fighting at 40 years old against Roy Jones Jr., where I don't think Marvin Hagler would survive Roy Jones Jr. I think he'd get dropped a number of times. Mike McCallum had that defense so good, Roy couldn't get him out of there. And this is a 40-year-old guy, slow as hell. And Roy could not get Mike McCallum out of there. I'm just saying, man, Mike McCallum had a hell of a defense. Hell of a defense. At 35 years of age, Mike McCallum facing a 23-year-old James Toney and goes the distance and gets a draw. Some people argue James Toney won that fight, but nonetheless, because he really crashed Mike McCallum coming down to the end, especially the final round. But to get a draw off a 23-year-old, come on, man. Hagler wasn't even fighting that long. Hagler left the game, I think, when he was 33. I mean, come on, man. Y'all fucking Mike McCallum. And they never gave Mike McCallum a shot. Neither Hagler, no Leonard, no Hearns, no Duran. But we know he was a mandatory for Hearns, and he was a mandatory for Duran. And them motherfuckers didn't want to face him. All right? They didn't want nothing to do with Mike McCallum. Not to say that, I mean, if they could have gotten to fight each other, obviously they would pick that over Mike McCallum. But nonetheless, Mike McCallum knocked at that door. He wanted Thomas Hearns so bad. And Emmanuel Stewart said, you ain't going to get that fight. Another guy who was a very slick boxer, very skilled boxer was Kalambe. Sumbu Kalambe. Nobody really talks about him a lot because, again, he lost the fight to Michael Nunn. Michael Nunn knocked him out cold. He did all the wrong things against the southpaw. Probably Hagler would have handled him, but Hagler never faced that dude. He never faced the guy that Duran faced, Iron Barkley. All these guys were coming up at the same time. It was Barkley, McCallum, Julian Jackson, Julian Jackson, Kalambe. You know what I mean? It was a good time for Hagler to say, I dominated. I dealt with my era. I don't want these young cats. These young lions are coming up. I'm going to get out of the game. You know what I mean? I'm not mad at him. You're supposed to be able to do that. And Hagler left boxing in his prime and at the top of his game. Sugar Ray Leonard outboxing him, But Hagler could be outboxed. It wasn't like he was undefeated when Leonard faced him. He was undefeated as a champion, but he wasn't undefeated, when Willie the Worm, Worm Monroe had beaten him. Sugar Ray Seals had got a draw, but he really supposed to have gotten a win. And there was another guy, I forgot his name, and they all outboxed him. They just outboxed him. He could be outboxed, right? So it wasn't surprising that Sugar Ray Leonard beat him actually. And the thing about it is, a lot of people they build up this they build up this image about an aggressive fighter. Hagler was an aggressive fighter, right? He used to stop guys. They didn't go the distance with him because he didn't want to be robbed on the scorecards. The judges had robbed him of several fights where he had beaten a guy and he just didn't get the decision. So what Marvin Hagler said, all right, take every single fight in my hands. I think that's how he felt about Sugar Ray Leonard because he didn't get him out of there. He felt he was robbed, and he had been robbed several times in his career. But Sugar Ray Leonard beat him, and he beat him easy. And Sugar Ray offered to have a rematch with him, and Hagler declined it. So it is what it is. I mean, Hagler did also want never. He said he never coming back into boxing. He never go do it again after that. And true to form, he did come back into boxing, and I guess he's salty about it till this day, which is why he bashes the present fighters today. But what people don't understand is Hagler wasn't really known for his great boxing ability. So when Sugar Ray Leonard said, Hagler's a great boxer, he actually has good boxing ability. Hagler took that to heart, came out trying to box Leonard in the first and second rounds. Because Hagler was more of a brawler. He was more of a banger. Yeah, he could switch hit and shit, and he had some skill, but he wasn't really known as a boxer. He could box a little bit, work off the jab and keep you at bay if you too dangerous or whatever. He was a boxer. He had nice little feints and stuff. Don't get me wrong. But he wasn't no slick boxer. He wasn't a guy that, you missing all the time. He was a guy that blocked a lot of punches, didn't get caught a certain way, but he wasn't slick. James Toney, on the other hand, slick. You know what I mean? Michael Nunn was on the scene. It was Michael Nunn, James Toney, Suleiman Kamlembe, Julian Jackson, Iron Barkley. These were the new cats on the block. You know what I mean? And Hagler, that wasn't Hagler's era. So I'm really not mad at him. Even though he was still in his prime when he left the sport of boxing and he should have faced one or two of them. I can't be mad at him because he cleaned up his era. He cleaned up his time. Right, he faced all the guys of his era, his time. These were no young pups coming up. They'd gotten a couple belts and stuff. So and then the IBF had come on the scene by that time. So it is what it is. But like I said before, Marvin Hagler, people got this image of him because he left the sport. People say it was a controversial decision against Leonard. We know Leonard beat his ass. Leonard beat his ass. I used to think that Hagler beat Leonard because of the body shots later on in the fight, which I knew had an effect on Leonard. But now looking back at it and how Leonard controlled the fight and how Leonard was the one, that Hagler was going with his game plan. The momentum was always in Leonard's favor. He was playing mind tricks with Hagler. He did a lot of things to Hagler, taunted him and stuff to play mind tricks to burn him out. And just the way how he overall handled that fight, Leonard beat Hagler. I mean, and not by no small margin either, big margin. He beat him like 9-3, and we called that fight already, and we saw in real time that Leonard actually beat Hagler. But the blueprint was there since way back when Hagler had lost to Willie Monroe and Sugar, and he drew with Sugar Ray Seals, and he got beat by what? It's not Watts. It's another. I'll remember the guy's name in time, but he got beat by another guy too. You know what I mean? He did get his get back, but his style continuously was vulnerable to guys who really was slick boxers and skilled. So I mean, guys like Mike McCallum, who is slick. Mike McCallum is a very slick boxer, actually. Mike McCallum, James Toney, Roy Jones Jr. Them boys were giving problems. Even an awkward fighter like Montel Griffin will give him problems. You know what I mean? But of course, Montel Griffin was in a different weight class. He was never at middleweight. Some other modern middleweights who would give him problems because of his size, Triple G. Again, straightforward fighter. You know. hmm Canelo would give Hagler a lot of problems. A lot of problems. Thinking fighter. Again, James Toney is like, if he didn't want you to touch him, you're just not gonna touch him. He would give Hagler a lot of problems. Um, Jamal Charlo would give Hagler a hell of a lot of problems. Demetrius Andre definitely would box circles around Hagler. Southpaw, everything. He'd just give Hagler a hell of a lot of problems. Okay. Billy Joe Saunders will give Hagler problems. These are slick fighters. Derevchenko will give Hagler problems. So any guy would give Triple G problems because Triple G's kind of like a similar fighter to Hagler, except he didn't switch it. Would give Hagler problems. Just what it is. So, Hagler versus James Toney, that fight goes to James Toney, unless they steal it from James Toney. James Toney was lazy, but he was a bad motherfucker. Very skilled fighter. So that's my take on Hagler versus James Toney. You guys leave your comments in the comment section who you think would have won and why. I'm gonna catch you guys later. What you need in the building. Peace.